20 years ago, I was stolen from my crib. Most of my life was spent in a maximum security psychiatric ward, where doctors labeled me a high-functioning sociopath. When my biological parents finally found me, I changed. I didn't want to scare them, so I became a timid, fragile girl who startled at her own shadow. My mother treated me like glass, brewing bone broth each afternoon and choosing pink lace-trimmed pajamas for me. My father kept his voice soft, afraid to startle me. My brother Connor wouldn't even let me carry plates, worried I'd get hurt. But today, the act ended. Valerie, the daughter they raised before finding me, came to seize my father's company shares. She kicked the door in, her billionaire fiancé Peter beside her. She smashed Connor's arm with a baseball bat, then forced my mother to her knees on broken glass. Peter pointed at me and sneered, "Crawl over and lick my shoes clean. Do it well, and I might leave your bodies whole." I watched blood drip from my father's lip. Deep inside, the last thread holding me back snapped. I sighed softly, locked the front door, and picked up a serrated boning knife from the kitchen. Looking at my parents, I said, "Close your eyes. What happens next isn't for family viewing." Peter pressed his designer's shoe harder into my mother's hair and let out a bark of laughter. "You're out of your mind, sweetheart. What are you going to do with that?" The bodyguard standing next to him cracked his knuckles and raised a steel pipe. I didn't answer. I just walked toward him, my slippers crunching over the bloody glass. The bodyguard swung the pipe in a lethal arc aiming for my skull. I sidestepped, letting the heavy steel slice through empty air. I grabbed his wrist, locking my fingers around his pulse point, and twisted violently outward. A wet crunch echoed through the living room. Before he could scream, I drove the heavy brass pommel of the knife directly into his temple. He dropped like a sack of wet cement. I wiped the bloody handle on the shoulder of his tailored suit, stepped over his twitching body, and kept walking toward Peter. "Don't you take another step." Valerie shrieked, her face pale as she peeked out from behind the ruined sofa. "Do you even know who Peter is?" she yelled, her voice trembling. "The people backing him will wipe you off the map. You lay a finger on him, and the entire Cohen family burns with you." I stopped. I slowly turned my head to look at her. "Valerie." She swallowed hard. "What? Did you just say you were extorting these shares to save the Cohens?" Her eyes darted around the room. "Look, Riley, I know it sounds awful, but my hands are tied. Peter's family agreed to inject $30 million into the company, but only if they get controlling interest. Arthur and Eleanor are getting old. Connor's health is declining. If I marry into his family, I can at least keep an eye on them." I nodded slowly, letting the words hang in the air. "So, you're the good guy here. I'm glad you finally understand." "You're a saint," I said, staring at the serrated edge of my knife. "So get on your knees." Valerie's voice hit a shrill pitch. "Are you psychotic?" "Yes." I closed the distance before she could blink. I twisted my hand into her hair and slammed her downward, her kneecaps cracking against the hardwood floor with a sickening thud. My mother pushed herself up, her voice quivering. "Riley, Mom, I told you to keep your eyes closed," I said, my voice completely flat. "I'll help you change your clothes in a minute. Some ice will take care of the bruises." Behind me, Peter roared. He snatched up a heavy oak dining chair and hurled it at the back of my head. I tilted my neck. The chair leg grazed my ear and shattered against the wall. Releasing Valerie's hair, I pivoted. Peter was still frozen in the follow-through of his throw. I looked down at his expensive Italian loafers. "What was it you said earlier? Crawl over and lick your shoes?" Peter took a shaky step back. "Let's talk about this." I snapped my leg up and brought the heel of my boot down on the bridge of his foot with every ounce of my weight. Peter let out a guttural shriek, folding completely in half as he collapsed to the side. I grabbed him by his expensive silk tie, dragging his dead weight across the floor until he was inches from my boots. I pressed the tip of the boning knife under his chin, forcing his head up until he was choking on his own tie. "Leaving our corpses intact," I whispered. "How exactly did you plan to do that?" Peter just gurgled, his mouth full of blood from where he had bitten his own tongue. The remaining two bodyguards exchanged a panicked glance and lunged at me together. I shifted my weight. The blade sliced clean through the first man's wrist tendons. His steel pipe clattered uselessly to the floor. The second man leaped onto my back, locking his thick forearm around my throat. I dropped my center of gravity, ducked my chin, and threw my head back, smashing my skull directly into the bridge of his nose. Partle had shattered. He stumbled backward, clutching his ruined face. I walked over to the kitchen sink, casually rinsed the blood off my hands, and looked back at Peter. He was curled up on the rug, cradling his mangled foot. "Security," he screamed, his voice cracking. He slammed a panic button on his Rolex. "Breach on the perimeter." I tossed the knife into the fruit bowl and walked over to my brother. Connor was slumped against the wall. His arm was bent at a grotesque angle, his forehead slick with cold sweat. "Connor, how bad is the pain?" "I'm good," he gasped out, trying to force a smile. "Barely feel it." I patted his cheek. "Hang in there." My dad was sitting in the corner. His lip was bleeding, but he wasn't looking at his attackers. He was just staring at me. Before I could say anything, a heavy rumble shook the driveway. The sound of combat boots marching in unison drowned out the evening crickets. The front doors were blown inward by a breaching charge. The heavy wood and iron hinges collapsed onto our entryway rug, sending a cloud of drywall dust into the air. Richard, Peter's father, stepped through the smoke. Behind him stood dozens of hardened enforcers, all gripping heavy steel rebar. Richard looked down at his bleeding son, his face twisting in pure rage. Then he looked at his men. "Kill every single Cohen in this house. Make it look like a home invasion gone wrong. Keep it clean." Cotter forced his good arm over my shoulder desperately, trying to pull me behind him. "Riley, get upstairs. Hide. Cotter, put your arm down. I'm fine. My arm is fine." I looked at the swollen, purple flesh of his broken limb. I gently peeled his fingers off my shirt and pushed him back down to the floor. "Sit, don't move." Dozens of steel pipes were raised high. Richard's men fanned out, boxing us in from every angle. My mom threw her arms around my dad, squeezing her eyes shut. My dad held her tight, but his eyes never left me. I reached into my sweatpants pocket and pulled out a heavy, military-grade walkie-talkie. A faded, peeling sticker of a cartoon panda was slapped on the back. Richard caught sight of the radio and froze for a split second before a cruel smile spread across his face. "You calling for backup with a toy?" "She really is a psycho," one of his thugs muttered. I pressed the push-to-talk button. Feeding time. Static crackled for 3 agonizing seconds before a deep, gravelly voice replied. "Copy that." The signal died. Richard raised his hand to signal his men. I didn't move a muscle. First came the screech of burning rubber, followed by the deafening crunch of crushing metal. The impact vibrated up through the floorboards, rattling the crystal chandelier above us. Richard's enforcer spun around. Outside, a massive armored transport had just violently rear-ended Richard's Maybach, launching the luxury car into the garden wall. A chain reaction of collisions echoed through the estate. The lights in the living room flickered. Richard's smile vanished. In the gaping hole where our front doors used to be, 5 heavily armored tactical vans pulled up nose to tail. Emblazoned on their sides in stark black lettering was the logo. Blackwood Maximum Security Psychiatric Facility. The side doors were kicked open. A massive man with a jagged scar running down his bald head leaped out. He was wearing faded institutional scrubs, and in his hands, he gripped a heavy red fire axe. Behind him poured a tide of men in matching scrubs. They carried bone saws, crowbars, and heavy chains. They crunched over the ruined front doors and filed into the living room. Richard's thugs froze, their steel pipes suddenly feeling very inadequate. The scarred man, grim, looked around the room. He kicked a piece of shattered brick out of his way, walked straight up to me, and dropped to one knee, bowing his head. "Director." Richard opened his mouth, but no sound came out. I pointed a finger at Richard's crew. Grim stood up, turning to face the intruders. He didn't say a word. He just waved a hand. 3 minutes later, every single one of Richard's men was pinned face down against the hardwood, groaning in agony, completely immobilized by the inmates. Richard was backed up against the doorframe, his legs visibly shaking. The walkie-talkie in his hand slipped from a sweaty grip and clattered to the floor. Over by the sofa, Valerie was curled into a tight ball, holding her bruised ribs and sobbing hysterically. "Arthur, Eleanor, please, you have to save me. I'm your daughter. That crazy bitch is going to murder me." My father, still sitting against the wall, looked up at her through the wreckage. He stared at her for a long time. "You broke my son's arm." Valerie's sobs turned ragged. "Dad, please." "You broke my son's arm," my father repeated quietly. The entire room went still. Even Richard stopped breathing. My father had always been gentle, painfully gentle. The kind of man who apologized to waiters when they brought him the wrong order. The kind who carried spiders outside instead of killing them. But now there was something in his face I had never seen before. Not fear. Not grief. Judgment. Valerie crawled toward him through the broken glass, leaving bloody streaks across the floor. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," Peter said. Peter suddenly screamed from the rug. "Don't drag me into this." I looked down at him. He immediately shut his mouth. Connor gave a weak laugh that turned into a groan. "Little late for that." Grim stepped beside me, enormous arms folded behind his back like some grotesque butler. "Director," he rumbled, "what level of response are we authorizing?" Behind him, the inmates waited. Some rocked back and forth. Some smiled. One man was humming happily while tightening a chain around his fist. I glanced at my mother. She was staring at me like she didn't know whether to cry or faint. "Right. Family mode." I softened my voice instantly and crouched beside her. "Mom, can you look at me?" Her eyes trembled toward mine. "You're safe now," I said gently. "Nobody here will hurt you again." Then I pointed toward the dining room without even looking away from her. "Except him. Tear Peter apart." Peter's horrified shriek barely had time to leave his throat before 3 inmates dragged him across the hardwood by his ankles. "No, wait." Crash. His body disappeared through the dining room doorway. The sounds that followed were wet, heavy, and short. My mother made a choking noise. I immediately covered her ears. "It's okay," I soothed. "Don't listen." Another crunch echoed from the dining room. Connor looked vaguely impressed. "Honestly," he muttered, "that might be worse than the wood chipper guy." Dad blinked slowly. "The what?" I ignored that. Richard finally found his voice. "Do you know who I am?" He snarled at me, though the fear leaking through his expression ruined the effect. "You think a bunch of escaped lunatics can touch me? I own judges, senators, police commissioners." One of the inmates suddenly leaned close to him and inhaled deeply. Then he frowned. "This one smells rich." Another inmate perked up excitedly. "Can we keep him?" Richard went pale. "No," I said. They looked disappointed. "Ah." I walked toward Richard slowly. He backed up so fast he slammed into the collapsed doorway. "You," he breathed. "What the hell are you?" I stopped inches away from him. For a moment, I considered lying. Something harmless. Something normal. But my brother's arm was hanging in pieces. My mother still had glass embedded in her knees. And my father was bleeding. So instead, I told the truth. 20 years ago, I said calmly, a nurse sold me to traffickers for $40,000. The room fell silent. I was eventually recovered during a federal raid. By then, I had already killed 2 men. My mother let out a tiny gasp. I continued. The psychiatric facility took me because prison couldn't legally process a child that young. Blackwood wasn't a hospital. I smiled faintly. It was a cage. Grim lowered his head respectfully. Richard stared at me in horror. I tilted my head. "Do you know what happens when you lock violent people together for 20 years? Nobody answered. They organize. One of the inmates raised his hand politely. Director implemented a point system. Another nodded proudly. Conflict resolution seminars, too. Connor stared at them. You made a prison gang into a corporate structure? It improved morale, I said. My father looked like he was having a spiritual crisis. Richard suddenly bolted. He spun and sprinted for the destroyed front entrance. Fast. Desperate. For one glorious second, he almost made it. Then a heavy chain whipped through the air. Clang. The metal wrapped around his ankle, yanking him violently off his feet. He hit the marble floor face first hard enough to crack a tooth. The humming inmate reeled him back in like a fish. Richard clawed at the floor, screaming, "Let me go." Grimm planted one boot on his spine. The scream cut off instantly. I looked down at Richard thoughtfully, then at Valerie. She had gone completely silent now. No crying, no pleading. She just stared at me with a numb expression people get right before shock fully sets in. "You know," I said conversationally, "when I first came home, I really did want a sister." Valerie's lips trembled. "I watched videos online," I continued. "Matching pajamas, movie nights, shopping trips. I practiced smiling in mirrors because normal sisters smile a lot." My mother started crying softly. "But you kept hurting them." Valerie broke. "I was scared." She screamed suddenly. "You think I didn't know something was wrong with you? They loved you immediately. Dad looked at you like you hung the moon after 1 week." Her voice cracked apart into hysterics. "I was their first. I was their daughter first." Silence. Then my father spoke. "No," he said quietly. Valerie froze. Dad slowly stood despite Mom trying to stop him. "You were never our daughter because of time," he said. "You were our daughter because we loved you." Valerie's face crumpled. "And Riley," he said, turning toward me with tears in his eyes, "is our daughter because we love her too." Something unfamiliar twisted painfully in my chest. I hated that feeling. Grimm noticed immediately. "Director appears emotionally compromised," he informed the room. "Shut up, Grimm." "Yes, Director." Connor snorted laughter despite the pain. Dad looked at me carefully. "Riley, how many people have you killed?" The room became very interested in the answer. "I thought about it." "Directly?" My mother made a faint distress sound. Connor sighed. "That means the number gets worse after clarification." "A little," I admitted. Dad closed his eyes briefly. Then, to my complete confusion, he opened his arms. I stared at him. "What are you doing?" "Come here." "I have blood on me." "I know. That's unhygienic." Connor barked out a laugh. Dad's voice broke slightly. "Riley, come here." I don't really remember crossing the room. 1 second I was standing by Richard. The next, my father's arms were around me. I froze completely. My body locked up so hard my hands stayed half raised in instinctive defense. Nobody had hugged me in over a decade. At Blackwood, touching usually meant violence, punishment, restraints. But my father just held me tighter. "You came back for us," he whispered. Something hot hit my cheek. I touched it slowly. Water.
"Oh, right."
Crying. Behind us, one of the inmates whispered urgently, "Director is leaking." Another inmate punched him. "Show respect." My mother suddenly threw herself into the hug too, sobbing into my shoulder. Connor joined a second later, one-arming all of us awkwardly while trying not to pass out. In the middle of the wrecked living room, surrounded by unconscious bodies and armed psychiatric inmates, my family held me like they were afraid I'd disappear again. And for the first time, since I was stolen from that crib 20 years ago, I didn't feel dangerous. Felt home. The police arrived 43 minutes later, not because they were delayed, because every road leading to the estate had somehow become unexpectedly inaccessible. A cement truck had overturned near the East Bridge. 3 black SUVs had mysteriously lost their tires across the southern route. And someone had apparently released a truly unreasonable number of geese onto the northern highway. Grimm refused to explain any of this. By the time authorities finally forced their way through the gates, the scene inside the mansion looked less like a home invasion and more like the aftermath of a medieval coup. Richard's men were zip-tied together in rows across the marble floor. The inmates sat quietly nearby, playing cards. One of them had made tea. The officers entered cautiously with weapons drawn until they saw the dozens of security cameras my father had installed over the years. Every second of the attack had been recorded. Valerie breaking in, Peter threatening my mother, Connor's arm being shattered, Richard ordering the murder of my entire family. The lead detective watched the footage twice in complete silence. Then he slowly looked at Richard, who was still chained to a dining chair. "You threatened witnesses," the detective said flatly. "Attempted murder. organized assault, conspiracy, corporate fraud, illegal coercion. He paused. And that's just the first 10 minutes. Richard exploded instantly. You think this matters? He screamed. I own half this city. The detective looked deeply unimpressed. Not anymore. That was when federal agents walked in.
Real ones.
Dark windbreakers. Quiet expressions. The kind of people who never raised their voices because they never needed to. Richard's face lost all color. One agent tossed a thick folder onto the table. Richard Vale, she said calmly, we've been investigating your organization for 8 years.
Fraud.
Money laundering. Political bribery. Human trafficking. Murder. The list kept going. Apparently Peter's panic alarm had accidentally triggered a federal surveillance flag tied to an ongoing RICO investigation. Connor nearly dislocated his other shoulder laughing.
Peter himself survived. Technically.
The surgeons managed to save most of him. Physically, anyway. Emotionally was another matter. The moment he woke up in the hospital and saw Grim sitting beside his bed peeling an orange with a hunting knife, he suffered what doctors later described as a catastrophic psychological collapse. He confessed to everything. Every bribe. Every shell company. Every assault. Every hidden account. The prosecutors practically sent us fruit baskets afterward. As for Valerie, that was Messier. She wasn't charged with a larger criminal conspiracy. There wasn't enough evidence she knew the full extent of Richard's operations. But extortion? Assault? Accessory to attempted murder? Absolutely. At her sentencing, she spent the entire hearing crying while staring at my parents. Mom cried too. Dad didn't. Connor definitely didn't. Valerie received 12 years. When the judge asked if she had anything to say, she looked directly at me. You ruined my life. I stared back at her for a long moment. Then I answered honestly. No, Valerie. You ruined yours the moment you decided hurting people was acceptable if you were scared enough. She started sobbing before the guards even reached her. After that, things became strangely peaceful. Dad retired 2 months later. Turns out nearly being murdered changes your priorities. Instead of fighting to keep the company, he sold his shares at triple value after Richard's empire collapsed and the market panicked. We moved. Not because we had to. Because Mom said the old house felt spiritually sticky. Connor said that wasn't a real phrase. Mom threw a pillow at him. Our new home sat near a lake far outside the city. Quiet. Private. Safe. Mom filled the kitchen with plants. Dad started baking bread badly, but enthusiastically. Connor healed slowly. His arm never fully regained its old strength, but he adapted. Mostly he used it as an excuse to make me carry things for him. You traumatized billionaire mobsters, he'd say solemnly from the couch. Surely you can grab me a soda. I usually threw one at his head. As for Blackwood, the government tried to shut it down after the scandal exploded publicly. That lasted 3 weeks. Then someone leaked the internal records. Turns out Blackwood's patience had quietly prevented 17 violent prison riots, exposed multiple trafficking networks, and helped solve cold cases authorities had abandoned years ago. Mostly because I made rehabilitation programs mandatory. The media didn't know what to do with us after that. One news channel called me a criminal mastermind. Another called me a misunderstood protector. Connor's favorite headline was, Murder Therapist Saves Local Family. Grim framed that.
1.
Eventually, Blackwood was restructured instead of closed. Officially, I became Director Riley Cohen of Behavioral Rehabilitation Services. Unofficially, I remained the only thing on earth capable of terrifying 6-foot career psychopaths into attending anger management classes on time. Honestly, the promotion changed very little. The inmates still listened to me, mostly because they liked me, partly because they feared me. One evening nearly a year later, I came home after handling a particularly annoying hostage negotiation involving a forklift and a raccoon. I opened the front door.
And stopped.
The entire house was dark except for the dining room. Warm golden light flickered softly inside. I walked in carefully. My family sat around the table smiling at me. Connor grinned. You're late. Mom stood up holding a cake that was leaning slightly to the left in structural protest. Dad looked absurdly proud of it. I blinked slowly. What is this? Mom looked confused. Your birthday dinner. I froze. Oh, I said quietly, because I had never celebrated one before. Not really. Blackwood didn't do birthdays. My father's expression softened instantly when he realized. He walked over and squeezed my shoulder gently. You're 26 today, sweetheart. 26. I looked at the cake again. There was a tiny frosting panda on top. My throat tightened painfully.
Connor pointed at it proudly.
I made the panda. It looks diseased. Rude. Mom cut the cake while humming softly. Dad argued with Connor about candle placement. The windows were open. Summer air drifted through the curtains. And, for the first time in my entire life, there were no locks on my bedroom door. No restraints. No cameras. No fear. Just family. Just home. Grim later sent me a text at 2:14 a.m. Happy birthday, director. No one died today. Success.